All right, so once again, I'm here to talk about what in my last series of videos I ended up calling the Babel Tower Problem for non-Catholic Christianity. And it's really some argument to the effect that, not only is papal infallibility the only case in which we are able to receive the Christian faith on authority, but also, we cannot have independent insight into the divine essence, which means that, if we are going to try to figure out which church is true just by finding out who's right on doctrine, we either have the circular option of choosing non-Catholic Church A because they're right on doctrine. And how do I know? Because of the authority of non-Catholic Church A, not my own authority. And then how do I know that non-Catholic Church A has the authority to teach true doctrine? Well, it's because the doctrine that I receive from them is true. So this is circular. And you see, it's essentially circular in such a vicious way that it's random. And that's that is an issue. It means that basically the papacy is going to be our only non-random or non-circular approach to find the true church. I won't even say acumen-based. I will just say non-random or non-circular, because the epistemic situation is really that bad. If we take that second premise on board, that nobody has any independent insight into the divine nature. Now notice what happens when you assume someone does, or we can. It seems to make God a thing, some kind of finite and tractable subject, rather than an infinite and sovereign someone. And that we happen to find ourselves entirely at his mercy. We are entirely at the mercy of his own self-disclosure, or his own willingness to be found, if we are to find any knowledge about him or learn anything true about him. And I really think most Christians would sort of take this view. And then, but see, what that leaves you with, the only other option is you have to use some sort of non-special revelation-based criteria to find the true church. But the position that I don't think I can yet articulate with any sort of formality is that what I nonetheless suspect to be true, and something, if I wanted, I could just let operate in the background. But it's more than a suspicion. It's this very strong intuition, but like at the level of an unproven conjecture, let's say. You can keep betting on it, but you still maybe haven't formally proven it. In principle, there can be no. Okay, so let's put it like this: if you're using non-special revelation-based criteria to find the true church, like we discussed, continuity, whichever one is most like the early church, or I don't know, something like Occam's razor, or something like, let's just have the fewest sources that we can hypothesize, or coherence, like without ruling on whether or not any tradition has any contradictions in principle, which is a very high bar to prove, or is like manifestly, intrinsically incoherent. Let's instead just go with whatever tradition has the fewest apparent contradictions, which in the limit seems to lead to a kind of minimalism that I described as John's Gospel onlyism, but that was the logical limit. But for a more sort of compelling alternative, in the sense of its once having been alive, if heretical and fringe, form of Christianity, see something like Marcionism. It's more coherent, but it's unsatisfactory, in a sense, precisely because of that greater coherence. because it is so non-comprehensive. It has so little explanatory power with respect to, what has gone before in theology and in Revelation, and it arguably doesn't offer as much moral guidance and so on. So I've talked about these other criteria that would purport to let you know, not from special revelation, into which you have no independent insight, but nonetheless, essentially through human reason, that a certain non-Catholic church is the true church, or even if not with algorithmic or complete deductive certainty, just with a little bit of just with a modest preponderance of the evidence, or sort of a modest tilting of the balance of probabilities in its favor, such that the epistemic landscape is no longer flat in the way that the final pragmatic move of the mini-master / Babel Tower argument must assume in order to work. For more on which, please see previous videos. So the potential escape route is this non-special revelation based way of finding the true church, but it always requires some kind of criteria, basically. And the problem is that I can show that the criteria are always weighted in an arbitrary as opposed to a principled way. And if we're only operating with, if we're using some criteria, but the only weighting we can, if we're using some criterion or criteria, and the only weighting we can give to it or them is arbitrary, that ends up being able to prove pretty much any of the options that are available, and even some that people maybe never even thought of, in a way that, such that you don't really prove anything. If you can prove everything from some premises, you can prove nothing from it. And or put another way, the way I would like to put it is, one cannot be said to know Y from X, where one is also supposed to know not Y from X, where not Y is the complement of Y. That is to say, like in the Venn diagram, it is anything and everything but Y. So that it is what constitutes the negation of Y in some sort of set theoretic sense. So this is the issue with an unprincipled weighting of the criteria. And my more than suspicion, it's like a conjecture that I'm willing to bet the farm on, is that in principle there can be no principled weighting of the criteria. And this move is a little bit intuitive, but it's not very hard to see. Claude AI said the reason why is that it leads to an infinite regress of criteria, which is wrong. And I myself made the criterial regress argument some time ago, and I noted that it had a certain kind of force in favor of Catholicism, but it's nothing on which I would like to rest my whole case. It's just somehow not as cogent. It's not as easy to demonstrate the truth of the position from that point of view. So, I told Claude AI that is actually that the infinite regress problem, is like for the criterion, you need another criterion, and for that criterion, you need another criterion. But that problem is a symptom of what I would call the Babel Tower problem, which is that if we don't have independent insight into the divine nature, there will never be this Babel Tower criterion that we can find a positive one in any case, a first order one in any case, that we can find that will help us to span that infinite gulf between unaided human reason and the divine essence. And God says, as high as the heavens are above the earth, so high are my ways above your ways. Is that infinite gulf? And we already supposed that nothing can span it. And any principled weighting of the criteria, it has, in other words, we're supposing that there needs to be something that gains epistemic contact with that with which there can be no epistemic contact. Any principled criterion that would sort of let you have the principled weighting of the criteria that would let you find the truth of a non-Catholic church without presupposing special revelation knowledge and going down that circular route. And circularity is not intrinsically irrational, but when there is another option, it's easy to show that it is irrational and not to be preferred. Without that principled weighting of the criteria, you're not contacting any valid principle on by which you would weight the criteria validly or in a principled way has to be something that has this kind of epistemic contact with the divine nature or the divine essence. But if we are supposing that we have no independent insight into that divine essence, then that criterion either has to be given to us by an authority, which is circular, or the only criterion it can be is the negative one of saying there can be no positive criteria, nothing that discloses anything positive about the divine nature. All we can know about the divine nature, in other words, is that we cannot know it. That's what we're working with. So this is what I mean when I say, in principle, there cannot be a principled weighting of any sort of non-special revelation-based criteria by which one might purportedly find some hypothetically true but non-Catholic church. And I mean Roman Catholic. So that's a kind of an important recap of the Babel Tower argument and its logic. Now I'm going to go on to something sort of sort of like autobiographical, something I just kind of went through recently. Just a moment. By God's grace, I had the good fortune to attend the so-called Conference of Trent up in Frisco, which is not far from where I live, nor is it very far from what I understand from where Trent Horn lives. I don't know where he lives, but I think it's public knowledge that he lives in Texas, in North Texas. And I live in Dallas, or close to Dallas. But, the Conference of Trent, I was up there, and I got to speak to a number of people about my argument. I think I might have made something of a gadfly of myself, because in a sense, I wasn't there to talk about them, but about me. And, that's on me. Mea culpa, if that's what it was. Or if that was a faux pas, let's say. But nonetheless, for, the purposes of making this argument and testing its validity, it was a very valuable experience for me to have, if only in this very selfish way. And I got to speak to a number of people whom I don't think it would be inappropriate for me to name drop, because, it's public knowledge that they were at that convention. And I don't think that they didn't disclose to me anything which had to be kept in confidence. So I got to meet Swan Sona, whom I have liked and admired for some time. He seemed positive toward my argument in the sense that he could see where it was going and could not detect any error. Nonetheless, it seemed to me, this is just my own subjective personal opinion, but it seemed to me that he did not actually realize how important the implications of my argument are for Catholic apologetics at the ecclesiological level or at the in-house Christian level. And that is something that I intend to go into more detail about as this video goes on. But I met Swansona. I met Gideon Lazar, with whom I also shared the argument, but I didn't think he would be interested as much. And I don't think he necessarily really was. But I love Gideon Lazar. I have great admiration for him. As well as a certain Ash Mize, who's a very interesting man that I got to meet in person at the convention. Who else? Well, let me see. I got to meet Cameron Bertuzzi, which was a surprise. And he also seemed to receive the argument positively, to see where it was going. But he didn't really have time to learn more about it in the moment. Nor do I think he necessarily sensed the implications of it. So that's like 3, I want to say. I can look at my notes to remember who else was there. Oh, okay. There was a certain Braden. I don't know his last name. He is the one who runs the Catechumen channel. And talking with him was a real pleasure. I think he's younger than I thought he was, though. I don't know. Because I'm like 36. I don't want to be talking some kid's ear off. Like, if he is a kid, he's not. He's got like a whole family, but which is, he has a very beautiful family. I had a great time talking to Braden. He was very generous in his time with me. I knew from watching a certain video of his own that he had released on the topic of sort of which church is the true church and how do you know, that he has a sort of a questing mind that is not really content with, I think, like these purely kind of first order, let's litigate every single theological issue and whoever's right on every single one is presumptively the winner. I think he thinks more in a principles-based way and wants to, as it were, know the reason why the Catholic Church is true and not just why everyone else happens to be false, which is manifestly not the same thing, about which I'll go into more later. So he allowed me to make the case in great depth, in his presence or before him, and I think even to the point where it got a little annoying. But it was great for me to be heard and seen, because he really it seemed to me that he's a very intelligent and wonderful young person, and that it was very enjoyable to share the argument with him, because it seemed to me that he really understood it. Let me see who else. I know I didn't get to share it with Trent Horn. Just never really. I didn't want to impose on him, and I probably imposed on everyone else that I did talk to. So that's kind of saying something. Just the circumstances didn't really work out like that. I met some people that are cool people that I've seen online, but in as much as I didn't talk to them about the argument, I don't think is necessarily pertinent to just like name drop, just almost for the sake of name dropping. Got to meet some very nice, intelligent, young Catholic men that are not necessarily like famous content creators or what have you, but it was very much worth my while to meet them. Let me see. Joe Heschmeyer. I don't know how obvious it is from my videos, but I consider Joe Heschmeyer to be the kind of the non-pareil. To me, he is the strongest proponent of Catholic apologetics currently working. I have great admiration for Joe Heschmeyer. And so I was very nervous to share my argument with him, but also very intent on presenting it to him, because in a way which I now recognize was somewhat naive. I assumed that he would just be very interested in it, and that he would immediately see all the implications of it, and or I should say, or that he would see all of the implications of it, assuming that having seen the implications, he would in fact then be interested, right? Which I can't necessarily assume. But I kind of thought he would be, because Joe Heschmeyer, more than other Catholic apologists, well, I'll say this, in general, it seems to me what I like about Catholic apologetics is that whereas non-Catholic apologetics tends to be like this sort of come and see that we're right on every theological issue, as if their only option is to show how everyone else is wrong and then be right by default, which you still aren't necessarily right by default, because it could be everyone else is wrong and you're wrong too, either on one of the issues that was examined or some yet unexamined issue. And then it's raising the question of how accurate do we need to be? Some Protestants are comfortable with some, suboptimal level of accuracy. And I've discussed that before. Like, even if we make that assumption, if we don't know anything theologically, it's still dominant to bet on the assumption that the papacy is true, just because you have no specific information to rule it out. But no matter, so in general, Catholic apologetics doesn't seem to make that move. It seems to recognize something is wrong with that move. And so Catholic apologists don't tend to argue like the reason why the Catholic Church is true is that we're right on all the issues X, Y, A through Z. They don't tend to do that. They, which is more so like the ortho bro apologetics, and from what I've seen. The Catholic Church presumes rather what the kids would call the Catholic apologists presume rather what the kids might call a certain main character energy. And they just feel like they can say, well, just believe us because we're the church that Christ started. Which I like it on the one hand, in the sense that it's avoiding the inelegant, piecewise, so many words I could use, retrospective, residual, a posteriori, I don't know, I could go on and on, enumerative. These are nice, lovely words that the chatbots gave me. Approach of just saying like, we're right because every other church is wrong. So I like it that it doesn't do that, but I don't like it because it's very much begging the question, especially not even for someone who's invested in some other tradition, but even just for those who just want to know the truth. Because if you say, trust us where the church Christ started. Oh, really? The Eastern Orthodox cannot say that? The Oriental Orthodox cannot say that? The Assyrian Church of the East cannot say that? The Anglican Church, for that matter, it cannot say that? So what do you mean? Is that settles the matter all by itself, It's quite unsatisfactory. And in both directions, I have seen Joe Heschmeyer specifically, who, again, I'll just say it, is my favorite apologist. I have seen him say in his book, Pope Peter, so I've read him, whatever. I seen him say that to the Protestants, do you really think that Jesus set it up this way? That we should just go look at every church and find out who's the most correct on doctrine, and thereby decide which church is true that way. And I admit, when you put it that way, it sounds somewhat implausible. Yet, here's the issue, is that from their point of view, they don't necessarily know that there's another way. You know what I'm saying? Well, how else are you to do it? And certainly the kind of reflexive move of, if you decide not to decide, you've still made a choice. If you outsource all your authority to the Pope, well, that's still a decision. But even more pertinently, why should I do that to him versus the Eastern Orthodox Episcopal authority, or the Anglican, or the Oriental Orthodox, or the Assyrian Church of the East, what have you? Why not them? It's still remaining unanswered, that question. I met a guy there. I don't think he would mind if I shared his name. Well, his name is Garrett. I don't know what his last name is. He just has, everyone had business cards, which kind of made me realize I needed to be having cards, but I thought we don't do that anymore, except they all have QR codes, which is like, oh, see, it is a thing that we're doing or something. I don't know. So, but I was so low budget that I just took offering envelopes and wrote my name and number on them. Anyway, but this apologist Garrett, I'm gonna try to summarize his argument. This is one of many arguments that he makes, and he makes them all separately on various cards. It's a very smart move. And this argument says how to know if you're a heretic. And the root of that word comes from Greek, like hereo, I choose, or something like that. And he's saying that, as long as you're choosing what you believe, you're a heretic. Which to a certain extent, does that really discriminate Catholicism from the other non-Catholic ancient churches? Good question. Actually, does it really discriminate them from any one of them? Because, how to put it, if I go to Curry Blake's church and I just trust his reading of the Bible, it's like I'm no longer choosing what I believe. He's choosing all my beliefs for me. It is not cafeteria, but it is a la carte or something like that. And then the question is just, whose authority, though, do I submit to? I will concede this in favor of Garrett's argument, that in a certain sense, there is more choosing going on in every other tradition except the Catholic one. In an absolute sense, it seems fair to observe. See, this is where it gets really weird because, and Jay Dyer, from what I understand, makes this point regarding what he regards as certain epistemic problems within Catholicism, which is basically like, all right, so you got this Pope / magisterium to rule on what traditions are or interpretations are allowed and what are not. So you have a greater, theoretically, you have the advantage of greater specificity as regards the interpretation and the declaration or the definition of dogma. Nonetheless, you don't always know what is actually among papal statements, let's say, uttered at a register that meets the criteria for papal infallibility. And you know what? He's certainly right about that, in the sense that once you get inside the Catholic tradition, there are some guardrails that are pretty staked out, but it's almost like on a smartphone, you can keep zooming in. So it's kind of relative. It's like once you get inside that specific corner of the picture, you can blow it up so that now it's taken up the entire screen. And there's a lot of possible variation of views within Catholicism. And which one is right, you don't know. So I think that the kind of really problematic non-Catholic argumentative move that is made here is like, well, since you can't have infinite certainty on any view, like why even what advantage does the magisterium even offer? It's sort of like, to me, the analogy that comes to mind is like in Georg Cantor's Transfinite Mathematics. We can understand that the set of whole numbers is no less infinite than the set of real numbers. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All that is no less infinite than 1 and 1.1 and 1. Or like 1.12 or no, I mean, gosh, or 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, etc. But within all of those, you have infinite kind of subdivision, or like this kind of infinite Zeno's paradox, like incremental approximation, but never actually getting there. Okay, but they're still they're both infinite. You can't say whole numbers is not infinite, but there's a certain way where the set of real numbers has a denser numerosity. Or put another way, some sets are more infinite than others, which is not very. But what I mean is that yes, within every kind of set of defined parameters, there's like a kind of potentially infinite room for questioning and variation. But it's still nonetheless occurring within more defined parameters, which all else equal means more information. And it means that more information has been clearly imparted and communicated. So as an argumentative move, from the non-Catholic side, I don't think that it works. So why was I on this? I mentioned how J. Dyer points out certain what he regards as epistemological problems within Catholicism. Oh yeah, and I'm talking about Garrett's argument, and basically that I will concede that basically because the other traditions are less specific than Catholicism as regards what's in and what's out, while acknowledging that everyone has this kind of subdivisibility within acknowledged parameters, kind of like you can keep blowing up the picture on your phone, if that's a good analogy. Nonetheless, because everyone else is less specific than Catholicism, there's like necessarily a lot more choosing going on. So Eastern Orthodoxy, for example, you can't just roll up there and ask, hey, what's the Eastern Orthodox view on whatever? It's like you read the fathers and you basically decide for yourself. Whereas the Catholic position will have like defined answers for a lot of those questions, even if it will not, like almost by definition or almost necessarily will not have like infinite answers. There will be a level at which you also bottom out or something as far as the explanatory depth of the tradition. But it's still more choosing going on in Eastern Orthodoxy. Oriental Orthodoxy, I know less well, but I would assume it is the case. I would assume they have less staked out views. Why do I make that assumption? Because they're conciliar, as if the Catholic structure is not conciliar, but they're merely conciliar structure with no head with truly executive powers. Like, it means probably they don't have as staked out views as the Catholic Church does, but I could be wrong. Protestants, certainly. Anglicans, there's a lot of variation within Anglicanism. And so, to the extent that, but see, it makes it less elegant because it's like, if you're choosing, then you're a heretic. Or really, I should say, unless you're choosing the minimal amount that you could be choosing, then you're a heretic. And then, of course, one could still kind of go the Rush lyric route and say, but if you decide not to decide, you've still made a choice. You choose not to choose, that's still a choice. And it's like, yes, but to give Garrett's argument its due, it's like to choose not to choose is sort of that is the only way you could not be a heretic. Otherwise, there's no sense in having a category of heretic, which Scripture seems to have, and every kind of tradition seems to have. So, anyway, I kind of went on that tangent for a while. I pray that God will help me recover where I was thinking. And the other thing I was thinking was, maybe because I haven't been relying on slides, but I think even in my most recent slideshow presentation, I failed to note the way in which the Babel Tower argument, insofar as it is distinct at all from its predecessors, which it kind of is, just in virtue of being a little bit more defined and more clearly presented, it is this argument is certainly dedicated to the Immaculate Heart of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and I would like to invoke the intercession of Mother Mary right now for the success of Catholic apologetics. Mother Mary, pray for us. I do know where I was going, which is Heschmeyer. Because, Heschmeyer said, do you really think, in Pope Peter, that Jesus set it up to where you should just go to each church and see who all has the truest views? And it's like, granted, when you put it like that, it seems implausible. Yet, it begs the question, because from the standpoint of the people who are doing that, they're saying, in effect, on what other basis is one to choose the Catholic Church, especially given that other traditions have the same level of apostolic continuity, historical continuity, but even also look at this, it's still begging the question to say you need that continuity, because it's begging the question against the possibility that everyone could have lost the plot, and that now in such a situation, those with most continuity are just those who happen to resemble the earliest normative church, whatever it is, which is also problematic to select when you're a finite human being with no independent insight into the divine essence, but let that lie. If we don't beg the question and assume that basically all the traditions can or cannot have gone off course, then the one that is most continuous is not necessarily one that has unbroken apostolic succession. It's just one that either resembles the structure and or has more doctrinal continuity, whether or not it possesses apostolic continuity. Depending on historical circumstances, it could be precisely because it lacks historical continuity rather than in spite of that fact. So, if that makes sense. So, and the other thing I've heard Heschmeyer say in a shameless popery, just like live, whatever. I can't remember what it's called. Someone was talking about some council in the 9th century, and did it really happen this way, like the Orthobros say, or did it not? And Heschmeyer said, if you really think, I'm paraphrasing, but he really said something like this, that if you really think it comes down to some obscure historical footnote about the way something might have or might not have happened in some council back in the 9th century, and that Christ, as it were, expects you to dig this up in order to know which church is the true church, you've really lost the plot. And it's like, okay, fair. Once again, I'm seeing that it's implausible that it would seem to have got down to this, but insofar as there is this kind of doctrinal disagreement, especially note this, doctrinal disagreement over which we acknowledge people in good faith can come to different conclusions. Because if we say, the only reason somebody's not Catholic is he's not in good faith, he's pretending to not see what is just so obvious, which is a repellent move that I at least will never make. But, whenever there's doctrinal disagreement that people in good faith can come into different conclusions about, then it's certainly question begging to say that there is some other basis on which we should be choosing which church is true. And so the seeker who wants to know whether a certain thing happened a certain way in a 9th century council, granted, he's maybe not staking the entire thing on that, probably isn't. But he wants to know, as part of a sort of cumulative case that he's trying to build for the, presumptive truth of whatever he suspects is the most likely to be the true church. Because, for lack of any other alternative, this is what he must do. So, this is also why, in my, again, naive way, possibly, I'm really just trying to get it across that I'm intending no disrespect at all to Mr. Heschmeyer, and that I only have admiration for him. But in my kind of, let's say, autistic and mind-blind way, is that disrespectful to autistic people? I have to be careful, It's like, I myself, I don't know if I have autism. My whole life, people have suggested it. I'm kind of on that line where it kind of almost makes less and less difference whether it's autism or whether it's just subclinical, almost autism. But anyway, theory of mind difficulties have been real for me, especially when I was younger. So, but just maybe in some way where I assumed he's seeing what I'm seeing. I thought he would catch on to what I think are the implications of this argument immediately, but he did not. Or in the sense of, he did not appear to, because he did ask me this. He said, who is this argument for? And I said, well, it's for me, which is again sort of like showing a kind of self-referentiality or mind blindness, or maybe say lack of cognitive empathy toward other people potentially. But what I meant is what I've been trying to say up till now, which is I want to find something that isn't just why is every other church wrong, but why is the right church right, which is not the same. And you can see the not sameness of those things from a number of different directions. Number one, if you know the reason why the right church is right, then on doctrinal issues X, Y, and Z on which all false churches happen to be wrong, you would have been able to predict that the Catholic Church would have gotten them right without having to investigate those issues. In other words, the reason why the right church is right is something like a true expression containing a free variable. The reason why every other church is wrong, that kind of a posteriori or enumerative case, is necessarily only dealing with concrete instances, and it is in principle incapable of extending over that remainder of possible issues that you have yet to examine. So the third way that you can see this is, just because everyone else is wrong doesn't mean you're right necessarily. Could be you're also wrong on one of the issues that you've examined everyone else in. Now, if you're using the Catholic position as the foil to demonstrate, what is right, in opposition to which everyone else is demonstrated to be wrong, fair. So then for all the examined issues, the Catholic Church will have been correct. But it leaves unaddressed the question of what about on some issue you haven't examined? Maybe the Catholic Church is wrong, such that everyone has gotten it wrong to some degree. That's still like best case scenario. I don't know. It's just not the same thing as being able to know that on every future issue as well, or every unexamined issue, it would still be true. Because it's like having a generalization or a theorem or something like that, as opposed to a collection of data from which we draw merely inductive conclusions. Okay. So, let me see. And so, I said, well, it was for me that I made this argument. But then I might have hastened to add that, but I'm going to write a book about it using an extended metaphor. And in this format, I believe that I can make it. Because I think what he said was, and more or less quoting, is like, your presentation was very rhetorically effective in places. Who is it for? So in other words, the logical sequence of that question makes me think that possibly your argument is a little bit too high concept to appeal to a broad majority of people, which is absolutely fair. But, what I will say is that, on these videos, it's obvious that this argument has been presented, not at some like ultra genius level, but it's at a higher concept level. Most people won't necessarily be able to follow along or be interested in it, or both. And the only reason I'm doing this is that I understand that if I just make certain claims that are a little bit too simplistic, they will be vulnerable to certain objections. That somebody who's not capable necessarily, or capable is a strong word, but who would not in the moment think of the objection, maybe later it could occur to them if they cared enough to study. Not that is necessarily the best use of everyone's time. And in some sense, we're trying to avoid that, but having to study our entire lives, like in this like insane way, like where we have to see who's right on every single issue, not only that we have examined, but that you could potentially think of to examine, which if we don't have any reason why the true church is true, and all we can settle for is everyone else, why is everyone else wrong? That's the road down which we're committed. It's not a fun road. It's not really reasonable. But anything less than that, it's not giving you true certainty. And whatever you can't really be certain about, is it really worth arguing seriously for it? Like dedicating, say, your life to Catholic apologetics if, the truth of the Catholic Church cannot really be known in this 100% way. It can only be known in this kind of 60-40 way, maybe. Maybe still it even is, because like my friend Mitch Capps likes to say, given I'm paraphrasing, given the seriousness of the matter in question, and given a certain assumption of theological realism, let's also add. If you're 51% certain, go act like you're 100% certain. Maybe. But for me, at least, I was always kind of acknowledging that, when I'm debating or I'm studying the filioque question for myself, when the arch philosopher or philosopher manqué or soi-disant philosopher has to get his hands dirty, and wade in the mud, metaphorically speaking, and roll up his sleeves and get into the tall weeds and deal with the actual particulars of history and try to read the Cappadocian Fathers and see whose view their view most resembles. Well, if I make certain interpretive assumptions and or decisions, which it seems more or less wise to make, then yes, I think that the filioque thing is more likely true than the other things. But, and theoretically, if they're right on the filioque, then they're right on everything, except not necessarily. But if you're assuming one or the other of them is right on everything, which why do you get to make that assumption? Then yes, the Catholic Church is going to win. But if you're only 60-40 on it, and why are you 60-40? Because at the end of the day, I am just a man. I do not have independent insight into the divine essence to where I can just look up and be like, oh yeah, I know my assumptions are right, because it's necessarily now going to correspond to the divine nature. Let me share something I wrote, because it's very important. Whatever constraint or property you are ascribing to God by saying either that X cannot be true of him, it cannot be true of the divine essence, that it would in some way imply that we must make the interpretive decisions that are required for the Eastern Orthodox position to be upheld, or even if you just say X is less likely to be true of him than some Y, X is less likely to be true of him than not X or some other view. That is to ascribe to him some constraint or property. Put it negatively or put it positively, however you prefer. As they say, omnis determinatio est negatio. Every determination is a negation anyway. Or maybe that's not such a common saying, but maybe it's just something that Hegel attributed to Spinoza. Maybe Spinoza never really ever said it himself. I don't know, but anyway, whatever constraint or property you're assigning to God has to be a constraint or property that either you claim to be able to deduce it about the divine essence a priori, which you can't do, or you receive it. I don't claim to deduce it about the divine essence a priori. I receive it. I receive it from the tradition that is authoritative. And how do you know it's authoritative? Because they're right on doctrine. And how do you know what right doctrine is? Because it's the one that comes from that tradition that I decided is authoritative. So it's totally circular. So this is where I'm getting at. You can say the Catholic reading is more natural. Meaning to say, if we just read it the way humans would tend to read it, then you're going to believe in the filioque. So, first of all, if you've been watching these videos, if you're part of that set of exactly 2 people, no, just kidding, but something like that, like the single digit set of people who's been watching a lot of these videos, you know that I have a certain bag of tricks and that I just default to them over and over again. You can deny the antecedent or deny the consequent. In this case, I can deny the antecedent and say, who says the Catholic reading of these Cappadocian Fathers is more natural? Or what do you mean when you say that? Do you mean it in such a strong way that you are saying necessarily people of good faith must all agree that this is the most natural reading? You can say that. It wouldn't even necessarily be wrong. But it's like That's the strong form of the claim, and a lot of people would be hesitant, I suspect, to make that claim. For example, I wouldn't want to make that claim, if only because so long as the question of which church is true is, even if you say it hinges on one issue, if you can't know that one issue with certainty, then it necessarily is now going to kind of network out and grab out a whole bunch of unrelated other issues or less related other issues, because now essentially to kind of bolster that case, which is maybe only 60-40. And I say 60-40 because at the end of the day, what independent insight into the divine essence do I have to say that these are, or even if this is the most natural, how do I know that the divine essence is of such a nature that the hermeneutic that God intends for us to use is the most natural one? Now you might say that's a dumb question, because God is interested in clear communication, isn't he? It's like, yes. And I'm going to show, or at least not necessarily, but this is going back to the thing I said at the very beginning, where we are supposing all of our ability to find God and learn more about God is a function totally of just his own willingness to be found by us and make himself understood by us. Then we pragmatically, we are never losing by betting that on the case where he is more willing to be found, just in the sense that there is never any upside from assuming that he is not willing to be found. Because if he's not willing to be found, you're not going to find him. It's like that old thing about like the guy is looking for his keys under the light because that's the only place he would be able to find them if they were there, which, like, what a dork. But it's like, no, not actually. Especially if, as far as you know, the distribution or the location of the keys is random. And the only place you could ever find it is under the light. That's the only place you could and would look. So it's just like, so we'll see how in a certain way this logic ultimately intrinsically always favors Catholicism. But, that's just denying that's like, I guess, denying the antecedent. I mean, here's the thing. Even if on just this one issue, it looks like the Catholic reading is the more likely one, as long as that inference is not airtight and logically necessary, it means that the case is the ultimate determination of the case is still going to rest on a whole host of other issues. And you're ultimately going to decide, like Jay Dyer says, like, if everyone's position is circular, I'm paraphrasing him now, because I think he believes everyone's position is circular. And I fundamentally don't agree with that. Technically I do, but in a highly qualified way. But if everyone's position is circular, then the only thing that really matters is coherence. So they can say, well, yeah, maybe you guys have a more, in some ways, natural reading of the church fathers, but everything else has to square and make sense, as at least as long as you cannot be 100% certain that the filioque falls into the, Catholic basketball hoop at the end of the day or something. Which, I mean, how could I, unless I had like this kind of independent access to the divine nature? All right. So let me just kind of gather my thoughts. See, I was saying my friend Mitch Capps likes to say, given the importance of the subject matter at hand, if you're 51%, act as if you're 100%. And it's like, well, except live my own life that way, maybe. But tell another person what to do? No. I'm not that confident about it. This is just how it seems to me. And if we're all ultimately working within a circular paradigm, it's not irrational for me to do what I'm doing on circular grounds, because it's what can I do? But it's like, if it happens to make more sense to another to go another way, it's not for me to tell him no. I mean, this is the way I think. Here's the deal. I mean, if it's also rational to do this. If you think the Catholic Church just is true for whatever reason, maybe it's even personal mystical experiences you've had, and you have certain charisms, which I myself do not necessarily possess, admittedly, then, it's a good use of your time and a rational use of your time and a beneficial use of your time with respect to Mother Church, that you do apologetics. I'm not saying that, but I'm also saying that for me, the way I come at it is like, if I'm only 60-40 on it, I'm actually not really going to consider this as something that's really worth sinking your time into, even though the notion of theological realism that is implied in a claim like Christianity is the true religion, every other is false, or like less true or something, would seem to imply that within Christianity there is a true position, and that, in distinction to other false ones, and that, all else equal, assuming, how to put it, if one religion is true and the others are false, it suggests theology matters. Well, within Christianity, once we get into that ambit of possible different Christian views, does it stop mattering? Not obviously, right? And the other thing is this: does theology bring you closer to God, or put another way, increase your chances of salvation? But I like John 17:3 that says that, this is the life, knowing the Father and knowing the Son whom he has sent, paraphrasing. Okay, the life is knowing the Father. Salvation is knowing the Father. Salvation is relationship. So if I speak of maximizing relationship or maximizing one's chances of salvation, it's actually tomato, as far as I'm concerned. But, I understand people can debate this, but here's what I'll say about this. That, let me see. Theology either matters to maximize, i.e. make as great as possible by however wide or narrow a margin, one's relationship or one's closeness with God, and or one's chances of salvation. Even if it only does so by a modest margin, let's say that having the full truth of Catholic doctrine makes you 2.1 times more likely to get into heaven. My other friend who's been reviewing my work for me said, why do you dare to put it in such gauche terms? But that's how my mentor, or not mentor, but it's in a one-sided way, my mentor Roy Schoeman puts it. It's like, it's increasing your chances of getting to heaven. Either having the fullness increases your chance of getting to heaven by some amount, like 2.1, as opposed to the next best thing, like Eastern Orthodoxy, almost true, but it's like 2.0x, all else equal, and Catholicism is 2.1x, all else equal, something like that. Well, if you multiply that little margin by the duration of eternity, which in some tortured sense is infinity, as though that were some number you could grab and multiply with other numbers, then even that tiny little difference is gonna make a world of difference. It's gonna make an infinite amount of difference. But put another way, so it's like, if it makes any difference, it makes infinite difference, seemingly. But if it makes no difference at all, then it's like, from the Christian standpoint, what justification can there be for delving into this? So in other words, it does nonetheless seem that theology matters, and that, within the ambit of different possible Christian interpretations, it's gonna matter to find the right theology. Really, in no principled way can I see that it would matter any less than the question of finding out which religion is true. So that, that's kind of another way you could look at it.